Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Grattan Institute Budget Speed Briefing. My name is Danielle Wood. I'm Grattan Institute CEO, and perhaps more relevantly for this one, also the Program Director in charge of budget policy. So what I want to do today is give you everything you might need to know about the budget in 20 minutes. I'm going to go through some of the headlines and takeaways. I want to talk about the broader economic strategy and whether it makes sense. And then I want to come to what's missing and including a bit of discussion about last night's budget reply. I'm joining the webinar today from Boomerang land. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging from that land and from all the lands with which people are joining across Australia today. Let's get into it. The budget headlines, if I could summarise the budget in one chart, it would be this one. And really the takeaway is that huge amounts of revenue flowing in, much higher collections than we expected, even compared to the last update just 4 months ago. Big increase in income tax collections because the recovery has progressed faster than anyone anticipated. Big increase in company tax collections because of the commodity price boom. Governments are spending a whack of that money. That is the kind of darker red bars that you can see under the line there, the spending policy line, but particularly in the next year. So there's a lot of front-end loaded spending in this budget. That is also evident when we look at the major budget measures. So this chart really tells us what are the big things that the government's spending money on or saving money on, which is much less common over the next 4 years. You can see there the cost of living tax offset. That is the increase to what was already a pretty sizable tax offset, the low and middle income tax offset that the government's put in place to ease cost of living pressures. That means that come tax time, once you've lodged your tax return, if you earn less than $126,000 a year, you can expect to get up to $1,500 back. There is also a cost of living payment for people on welfare, $250 a person, which will be rolled out over coming weeks. There was a big reduction in the fuel excise, much bigger than any of us were anticipating, 22.1 cents a litre, which will cost the budget $3 billion over the next 6 months. And the other short-term measure is around the COVID response. So the kind of the winter plan for COVID, which includes things like PPE, RATs, rollout of vaccine boosters. I think most of us would agree a pretty good investment given the very high personal and economic costs when the virus runs out of control. The other big feature of the budget was very substantial amounts of money that were happening outside those forward 4-year estimates. So big kind of packages around the kind of 10-year spending horizon. So large infrastructure package, $17.9 billion for transport infrastructure. The big surprise on the night was this regional package. It's much harder when you're pulling apart a budget to kind of work out what's new and what's not covered elsewhere when you're talking about things outside the 4 years. But certainly the headline figure that was quoted in the budget was $21 billion. It's been talked about as the price for getting the Nationals to sign on to net zero. $7.1 billion big picture infrastructure projects along the north of the country in central North Queensland, Hunter Valley, Northern Territory, Pilbara. Big whack of money for expanded dam projects, including $5.4 billion for a single dam, the Hells Gate Dam, which has yet to have a proper business case done, and large amounts for defence as well. And again, it's kind of hard to unpick in the papers exactly what's going on, but some of the headline figures, at least $38 billion to invest in a big expansion in Defence Force personnel by 2040, and some pretty sizable investments in Defence Force capability. So these are big numbers. What's the economic strategy that's going on behind all of this? First, to the kind of economic context, there is some pretty good news in terms of the outlook for growth. The left-hand chart is from the RBA, but it's pretty close to the Treasury numbers. Both are forecasting, a really strong rebound, and essentially that we jump back on the trajectory that we were on pre-COVID. It's being supercharged by strong consumer spending, 3.5% this year, estimated to increase to 5.75% the following year. Basically, Treasury is banking on consumers spending down the large amounts of savings that they accumulated during COVID. Investment also forecast to jump up significantly, partly a COVID catch-up effect and partly in response to the stronger economic conditions. The really good news, though, that leads to is the forecast on unemployment. We're already at 4. Treasury are now saying we will have a 3 in front in the next 3 months. And I think, when you take that alongside the fact the participation rate is up, the underemployment rate is down, this is unambiguously good news. It means there are people that are now able to work the hours that they want that were not able to previously. So this is a good news story. The reason I think a lot of people aren't feeling that good news so acutely is because of the wages picture. So it's yet to flow through to wages growth in a significant way. Wages growing 2.75% this year, reasonably modest, and particularly modest when you take into account the fact that prices are growing at 4.5%. So people are experiencing a real decline in their living standards. Treasury are forecasting that will turn around from 2022-23, that we will start to see positive real wages growth off the back of both higher nominal growth that you can see in this chart and lower inflation. A few words on the wages picture, because I know there have been a lot of people that have been quite sceptical about it. Yes, Treasury has been sort of systematically over-optimistic in the past, and I was certainly one of the people in the sceptical camp back prior to COVID. I am actually more hopeful this time round that these numbers could be right. We now have unemployment with a 3 in front. Those tighter labour market conditions, I think, will start flowing through to wages. It doesn't happen overnight. There are various institutional factors which mean it takes a while to pass through the system, but I think it's not unrealistic to expect the kind of trajectory that Treasury is talking about. My critique of the budget actually is more around the economic strategy and whether that makes sense. As I said, the government has supercharged the low and middle tax offset. That means come July, about $12 billion is going to be going out the door in payments to households. Add on top the welfare recipient payments, and you've got a really substantial household stimulus package, the sort of thing we would normally be doing in a recession, and is actually slightly larger than the first package in response to the global financial crisis. But we're doing this when times are good, when labour market conditions are tight, when growth is picking up, when we have budget challenges. It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The concern, of course, is further pressure on prices and inflation, and that's why you have a lot of market economists coming out and saying this is going to increase the probability of an early rate rise and perhaps lead to a larger upfront rate rise than we might otherwise have seen. The other question is around the kind of size and scale of the transport infrastructure package. Whenever you have big transport spending before an election, there'll be questions about whether this was kind of politically motivated or economically motivated. I would point out that the share of spending going to Queensland looks very high relative to their share of population or relative to their share of the freight task or passenger kilometres, whatever measure you might choose. And that's not just the case in this budget. That's been the case for transport infrastructure spending for the past 20 or so years, of which many people have pointed to the fact that Queensland is where elections are won and lost. But the bigger question, I think, really is, the risk of putting forward projects pre-election without proper assessments and without business case, and a fraction of them haven't gone through the Infrastructure Australia processes, as well as kind of feeding into a transport infrastructure pipeline which is already very full. So you can see here big increase in projects under construction over the past 5 years, rise in much bigger transport infrastructure projects, the so-called mega projects. And that backdrop, we've been hearing from state infrastructure ministers, from state treasurers, as well as from federal leaders about the challenges that's created in terms of shortages of key materials, shortages of key labour, some of the machinery needed. So the risk is if you kind of pump more into this pipeline, you're simply going to push up prices and delay existing projects. On the fiscal strategy, the government is targeting net debt to stabilise and then decline as a share of the economy. We can see that that is forecast to happen in coming years. I think, an extraordinary thing during COVID is, despite that very significant ramp up of net debt, interest payments have remained relatively low and stable as a share of the economy, and that's obviously been because interest rates have been quite low, but it has meant that debt has been very manageable and will continue to be so. My bigger question on the sort of fiscal sustainability side is the longer term picture. And we are coming out of COVID with higher payments as a share of the economy than what we've come in with. You can see their payments kind of stabilising at a higher level than what we saw pre-COVID. And that's, an extraordinary shift, frankly, from the conversation that we were having before the 2019 election. So if you just look at the chart on the left-hand side, the dotted line is where we were told payments as a share of the economy were going to go. They were going to actually reach as low as 23.6% of GDP by 2030. Now they're projected to sit about 26.6% of GDP by 2030. And that's not a COVID effect. You can see that's worked through the system. That's about higher long-term spending on things like the NDIS, on aged care, on defence. Those challenges were always going to be there, but to think that, we're looking at 3% of GDP difference without a conversation about how we pay for that. And we're still told, for example, that the tax cap will stay the same at 23.9% of GDP. So I think there are some substantial longer-term structural challenges that are not really being addressed by either side in the budget or budget reply. What's missing from the budget, for me, climate was the major emission. We've now committed to net zero by 2050. We are projected to make some projects, but pretty small progress over the next decade. If we do not do more by 2030, we're leaving ourselves with a very big task and effectively a significant and potentially disruptive transition. So in the budget, $1 billion around low emissions technology such as green hydrogen, very welcome. Our Climate and Energy Program Director, Tony Wood, has talked about the need to make sure that that's allocated well and based on a good set of criteria. $600 million for community projects to mitigate against the impact of natural disasters. Again, welcome, but small in the context of what experts say we will need, given the increased frequency and severity of natural disasters. But certainly the overall investment, as well as the kind of set of policies, look quite light given the significant economic challenge at hand. Women's workforce participation, very briefly, I think there was a missed opportunity to do more in terms of providing more incentives for women with young children to participate in tackling very high out-of-pocket childcare costs. The government have done some things, but I think there is still a way to go, and now would be the time, particularly given labour market tightness. There were some changes to parental leave, which unfortunately look like they might be a step in the wrong direction, rolling in 18 weeks paid leave for the primary carer, the 2-week dad and partner pay into a single 20-week package for families. It does provide more flexibility, but unfortunately, given what we know about the kind of gendered patterns of who takes leave, probably in most cases we will see women take the full 20 weeks. That is moving away from where the world is going, which is actually to provide more generous leave, including for a component set aside for dads and partners. And what we see in the many countries that have done that is you do start to see shifts in behaviour. Men are more likely to take leave. They stay more active in care. That has benefits for women's workforce participation, as well as broader social benefits in terms of family wellbeing and child development. Housing affordability was the other area which did get some attention in the budget, but probably not enough in terms of substantive measures. We know that there is a big challenge for people getting into the market in saving a deposit. That has got even worse in the last year with a very strong ramp up in prices. The measure in the budget to deal with that is the Home Guarantee Scheme, which helps people enter the market with a smaller deposit, effectively government going guarantor on the rest. There's an expansion of that scheme. It will help some buyers, but the challenge, of course, is as the scheme gets bigger, as you end up actually driving up demand and partly offsetting the benefit through higher prices. Nothing yet to tackle the big issues, particularly in terms of supply and planning, and we think the federal government could be involved in incentivising the state governments to move on that front. And nothing in terms of the investor tax concessions for housing. Rental challenge, rents are ramping up again. We know that the groups most likely to live in poverty are people that are on welfare payments and renting. Rent assistance has continued to not keep pace with rents over the past 2 decades and nothing to address that challenge. Some money on social housing to the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. That might provide more social housing because it provides loans to community housing providers, but the major impediment is actually kind of funding rather than financing, so not clear that will have a big effect. In terms of the budget reply, very briefly, Labor last night focused on, telling the story of measures they've already talked about around childcare, around climate, around manufacturing. The bit that was new that was on aged care, and really delivering on some of the recommendations of the Aged Care Royal Commission around nurses, the amount of time that carers have to spend with residents in aged care homes, improvements in food and accountability, about $2.5 billion over 4 years. They are also talking a lot about aged care wages. They haven't put any money in it for that. So whoever wins government, both sides will have to fund the outcome of the Fair Work Commission case, which is before the Fair Work Commission at the moment. Aged care workers asking for a 25% pay rise. No one is really talking about what that might cost, but that will be a challenge for whoever wins. But certainly, I think it would be welcome to see higher pay for these workers who are really, really poorly remunerated at the moment. And, we do have a massive challenge with attracting and retaining the workers that we need in this sector. Finally, not much in the way of long-term vision except for defence and infrastructure. So certainly encouraging whichever party forms government after the next election to have a look at Grattan's Orange Book, which sets out our vision for longer-term policy reform. I am going to leave it there. I think I'm going to have a look at questions. There looks like there's one. If anyone else has a very quick question, please feel free to pop it into the chat box and I'll see if I can get to it in the next 2 minutes. There is a question about the economic growth forecast. Look, I will take the questioner's point. I think, it is always a very challenging job to forecast wages, to forecast GDP growth. I think it is particularly challenging at the moment. There's a really great part of the budget where it talks about some of the sensitivity analysis around key parameters, and it does show that, that the bands are quite wide on these things. So, Amir, you're right. I think, the floods, the war may well detract from that growth outlook. But nonetheless, there are a number of things like the strong outlook for consumer spending, which I think do support the idea of higher growth. Was there anything on research and education of any note? There is some funding, Mark, for commercialisation of research within universities, about $2 billion, I think, going to that. That was the biggest measure. There is some money for improved skills training, which has been set aside, I think, if the state and Commonwealth can agree on a national skills agreement, there's money there as well. Question again about skills and training. Was it for the aged care workforce or was it strongly trades and construction? Really interesting question, Alison. So there was some training places announced for aged care workers. So I think that's good news. But the challenge, of course, for the sector, as I said before, is actually getting people to take up those opportunities and staying in the sector. So I think it's an area where you probably need to have training and wages working together in terms of ensuring those longer term workforce needs. There was also a package around kind of wage bonuses or payments to tradies and apprentices. There was very little detail on budget night as to which particular trades that would flow through. So apparently there's 70 or so priority trades on the list, but we weren't able to see on budget night what those will be. So I don't know if that list has since been released, but I think that is one to watch out for. Because a critique, I think, has been that a lot of money has gone into trades and apprenticeships, but really a focus more on the kind of male-dominated sort of construction trades rather than, as Alison says, into areas like childcare and aged care. We have come to the 20-minute mark. Questions are still piling in. I think I'm going to have to leave it there. There's some fantastic ones here, but I guess the good thing is to always leave people wanting more. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you want to see more of Grattan's budget coverage, we now have a section on our website where you can see it all together at www.grattan.edu.au. If you like our work, please do consider supporting Grattan as well. We do this to improve the quality of the public debate, but we are a not-for-profit and we do rely on your donations to continue to deliver this type of analysis. Thank you all and hope to see you at another Grattan event soon.